Hello, everyone. I am your host, and together we are discerning the truth. This is a series on Christian teachings, and in this video, we're going to be talking about the teaching that is life is a vapor, it is short, and we ought not to waste it as Christians. I'm going to be talking about three things. I'm going to be talking about the meaninglessness of life, I'm going to be talking about how your body is not your own, and then I'm going to talk about how life is short. So, first off, let's talk about the meaninglessness of life apart from God. We're going to be focusing on the book of Ecclesiastes for this section. Ecclesiastes was most likely written by Solomon, but we don't know that for sure. And I'm going to focus on three things from this book. I'm going to focus on pleasure, work, and purpose. First, pleasure is meaningless when it's apart from God. So it says in Ecclesiastes, I said to myself, come now, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good. But what that also proved to be meaningless. Laughter, I said, is meaningless. And what does pleasure accomplish? I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly, my mind still guiding me with wisdom. I wanted to see what was good for people to do under the heavens during the few days of their lives. So it makes it clear that pleasure apart from God is meaningless. Pleasure that is not within God is meaningless. And we can turn pleasure into an idol. And so leading a life that is hedonistic achieves nothing because it leaves us with no legacy. It says, what does this accomplish? It accomplishes nothing. All it does is make you feel good. It's also interesting how he says, my mind's still guiding me with wisdom. You see, he used wisdom to discern between that which was good and worthwhile and that which was meaningless. I think we need to adopt the same kind of mentality as we look at things in life that are purposeful and things in life which are meaningless. So we ought not to make pleasure an idol. The second thing I want to look at is work. It says, so I hated life because the work that I had done under the sun was grievous to me. All of it is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. I hated all the things I had toiled for under the sun, because I must leave them to one who comes after me. And who knows whether that person will be wise or foolish? Yet they will have control over all the fruit of my toil. I have poured my effort and skill under the sun. This too is meaningless. So, work in itself that is apart from God is meaningless. We live in a society that puts so much emphasis on work. And in fact, we live in a world which works to rest, but God made us to rest in order to work. So, God made it so that we could work 6 days and rest one, known as the Sabbath. And now Jesus fulfills our Sabbath. And that's how God designed us. We need to rest, but we rest in order to work for Him and then find joy in that work that we perform for Him. In our society, we see work as a barrier in order to rest. We see work as a barrier in order to make enough money so that we can retire and then one day enjoy ourselves, even though now we're so old that we can't enjoy it at all. It's a paradox. And so that's why we don't find any pleasure in our work these days. And that's why people sometimes will even kill themselves because of their jobs, or will be so depressed in their jobs that it just takes over their lives because we spend so much time at work. And so we don't find joy in our lives because we see our work as a way to achieve something that we think, which is money, will bring us joy. But then that, of course, doesn't bring us joy either, because everything we buy with that money, everything you have, will be given away to someone else, and you cannot predict what that person will do with it. So as it says here, right? It says that and who knows whether that person will be wise or foolish, yet they have all the control over all the fruit of my toil. So we don't actually own anything in this life. Everything that you own is someone else's because you're going to pass it down to someone. It's going to become part of an estate sale or something else. And so it's actually meaningless. Everything that you're working for is finite unless Your work is in that of the Lord, which is actually eternal. Working for God is eternal. So we can take pleasure and we can make that into an idol, but we can also take work and make that into an idol. And so this is how Ecclesiastes concludes. It seems like a very depressing book, but then you read the end and it says, "For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil." And so that's how the book ends. And what can we take from this? Well, we can take that one day we will be judged for what we did with this life and if we lived it with purpose. If we lived our lives just trying to be comfortable, just trying to make enough money so that we can be prosperous, that's a life that is finite and eventually doesn't actually mean anything for bringing on the kingdom of God. What we should be working for, which we should be doing with this life to give ourselves purpose and meaningfulness, we should be giving it to God and making sure that we are working for something eternal rather than just something that is of this world. And so I want to ask you, are you living your life with purpose or meaninglessness? It's not a question that I can answer. It's a conversation you're going to have with God on the day of judgment. And you should really be thinking about that. I think about it a lot. And I think we all ought to be thinking about that because that is something that concerns our eternity. So next I want to talk about how your body is not your own. It says, "Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will." This was written by Paul in Romans. And so, what does it mean by when he says we are a living sacrifice? Well, this is as opposed to the dead animal sacrifices that were carried out under the Old Covenant law, whereas when you kill a sheep, a lamb, and you use that as a sin offering to God, that doesn't that animal sacrifice is dead. You can't use it anymore. We, on the other hand, are a living sacrifice. But what is our sacrifice? What does that mean? Well, we are to give ourselves back to God. Jesus bought us, and we are now slaves to him. We're adopted into sonship, but we are slaves to him because he bought us with his precious blood. And so we're to give ourselves back to God. Now that he's freed us from our sin, we are to give ourselves back to him, and that is being a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. That is also our true and proper worship. So, living then in sin, instead of now Jesus has bought you your life with his blood, but if you continue to just live in sin, that's displeasing to God. That's doing the exact opposite of what he's bought you with, because we have been bought with a price. And so, therefore, we have to give ourselves back to him. And if we don't surrender ourselves back to him, we're slapping him in the face. So, you're either a slave to sin in this life or you're a slave to God. The choice is yours. If you think that you are free in watching internet pornography, if you think that you are free in continuing in habitual sin, in habitual lies, and habitual whatever, you're not actually free. You if you think about it, you've actually lost self-control, and that thing has become an addiction in your life that is actually controlling you. So you're either a slave to that sin, or if you surrender it to God, you become a slave to him, and there's actual joy in being a slave to God. That's what gives you in your life meaning and purpose. So living in the spirit gives us joy. Now, how do you know that you're shedding away your sin and you're coming into God's glory? Because oftentimes we're not perfect. I mean, 90% of the time we screw up. That's not an excuse for our sin. We don't have a license to sin. But how do I know I'm being sanctified? That's the process of going from sin into becoming holy. Well, what sanctification is, a really good definition of this is sanctification is the process of a growing hatred for one's own sin. And so we should want to do God's will as opposed to our sin. Every day we should be changing. We should be shedding that sin away, shedding that habitual sin away. We should be striving to become more and more like Christ. And if you're actually hating your sin, if you have a sin in your life that just doesn't seem to go away, if you begin to hate that sin and want that sin to go away, and you're praying about that sin, going to God's people about that sin, seeking help for it, if you're reading the word about that sin, you will gradually become more and more sanctified, and you will want to shed that sin more and more, and you'll become more and more like Christ until you are glorified. And so, in that process of doing God's will and shedding our sin, we have to understand that what this passage is saying about God's will is that God's will is a good will, it is a perfect will, and it is a pleasing will. So, the goodwill part means that it's that which leads to moral excellence. Evil leads to moral decay. His goodwill will lead to moral excellence. His perfect will, that means nothing could be added or taken away from God's will. And then his pleasing will means that it's pleasing to God and not necessarily ourselves. So to sum up this point, I'd just like to say that in order to become a living sacrifice to God, we are to shed our sin, and instead of trying to please and satisfy the flesh, we are to please and satisfy God's will. That's kind of a summation of this point that I've made. So moving on from the fact that your body is not your own, you're not to satisfy the desires of the flesh, but instead satisfy the desires of God. We will move on to life is short. So serving God starts today. No matter how long you live, you will be dead longer. And that's kind of talked about a lot in James here, which I'm going to be reading from. It says, "Now listen, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business, and make money. Why? You do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogant schemes. All such boasting is evil. If anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin for them." So don't assume that you can start serving God later on in life. You need to start right now, because when, as I said, no matter how long you live, you will be dead longer. If you live to 100 years, eventually 100 more years will pass into eternity, and you will actually be dead longer than you lived that 100 years. Death comes, and when it comes, it will take away everything in this finite life that you live. So don't concern yourself with this life that vanishes. Instead, concern yourself with eternity. And so you never know when it is your time to die. And there are plenty of excuses we can try and use to justify not serving God. One that's often used is, I'm too young. I use this a lot. I didn't want to make this YouTube channel because I felt that I was too young to be speaking on these issues. But time just kept wasting and wasting away. And I felt like I needed to do something. I needed to start serving God right then and there. Even if you feel like you're too young to be a teacher, maybe that's not your gift, but find some way to serve God starting today. Another thing that we use often in our culture today is something called FOMO, or fear of missing out. It's kind of that whole idea that, oh, YOLO, you only live once, so you better live it up. You better have all these experiences in life and before it's too late. Well, if you're living just for those experiences in life and you're making that an idol, well, then you're just settling for these experiences in this finite life where true joy isn't had. Instead of settling for these experiences in life, what we ought to be doing is we ought to be finding ways to work and bring joy into our lives for God. If we work for God and we are truly His children, we will find joy in doing His will rather than trying to do all these things before time runs out. So the world sees, you only live once as you better live it up and have as many experiences as possible while time is short. But how the Christian sees you only live once is you only live once, don't waste it. Don't wait until it's too late to serve God. So, to solidify that, I'd like to give an analogy. Imagine that you knew the governor of a state, and that governor was told you that there's a prisoner who's about to be executed, and I'm going to give him a pardon for his execution. But I need you to deliver the pardon to the executioner. So you take that pardon and you put it in your pocket, and then you go and you say, okay, I'll do it tomorrow. And you go home to your wife and your kids and you do all this stuff with them. And then the next day comes and you keep putting it off and putting it off and putting it off. And then one day you wake up in the morning and you're eating your Fruit Loops, watching the 3 o'clock news or whatever. And you hear on the news that this man was executed. He was executed, and it was found out that he was actually innocent, but it was too late because no notice for a pardon for his execution was given to him. It's funny how closely that kind of analogy resembles how we are in now. How would you feel if someone died because you didn't give the pardon for their execution? You'd feel awful, wouldn't you? Well, it's the same thing what's going on now. There are so many people who don't know Jesus, and we have the ability to tell them the gospel, but oftentimes we choose not to out of laziness or comfort or social anxiety. We need to put those things to rest and instead rely on God, because there are so many people who are dying and will never know Christ because no one ever spoke to them about who He is. No one ever planted that seed. So it's important that we serve God in this life, in the short time that we have. And so, would God say to you, if you died today, well done, good and faithful servant? Or would He say, get away from me, you worker of iniquity, I never knew you? I can't answer that for you, but it's something to ponder, because do you see yourself? Do you think that God sees you as a good and faithful servant and the way that you are living now? Anyway, that's all I'll say on those 3 points. Now we're going to conclude. And so, to summarize, I want to say that everything apart from God is completely meaningless. We need to live our lives for Him if we want to experience purpose in our life. Your body is not your own. Being a Christian came at a price. Jesus had to bleed on a 2x4 for you. And because of that, you owe Him your life. Not just this life, but your eternal life is owed to Him. But also, life is short. Don't waste it. Life passes so quick. I don't know where you are in life, but if you've graduated high school, didn't that just seem to go by quick? Or if you graduated university, didn't that seem to go by quick? Or now you're an adult and now you've got your life going, but everything just seems to be passing by so fast and it feels like you've done nothing? Well, that's because we can get into this tendency of thinking, oh, I'll start when I have this accomplished. I'll start when I have my mortgage paid off, or I'll start when I have my kids and they're grown up, or I'll start when I'm married, or I'll start after I graduate. No, start today. Life is short and you don't know when you're going to die. You don't know when it's your time. Last thing I'll leave you with is the actual cost that it takes to serve Christ. And this is a quote from Leonard Ravenhill. It says, you can have an experience with God in any religion, but an experience which costs you nothing is worth nothing and is utterly meaningless. So, what is your cost for serving Christ? This has been Discerning Truth, signing off.